Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Michael Green. I'm joined today by Ian Storey. Ian is Senior Fellow at the Yusof Ishak Institute, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and editor of the well-regarded journal Contemporary Southeast Asia. He has a book out on Putin's Russia and Southeast Asia, which we will unpack today, in addition to talking about the geopolitics of the region. Ian, welcome. As you know, we always start by asking how you got here. I know you've worked in Hawaii, went to school in the UK and Hong Kong, but where did you grow up? What got you into the geopolitics of Southeast Asia?
Well, hi, Mike. It's great to hear your voice again, and thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm excited to talk about the book and regional issues. So how did I get into this? Well, I took a course on Southeast Asian studies when I was at university in the UK. I got interested in the region through that. And then after I graduated, I moved to Hong Kong in the early 90s. And from there, I had a front row seat on the rise of China. I decided to do a PhD in Hong Kong and focus on China's relations with Southeast Asia, and particularly the South China Sea dispute, which, believe it or not, at that time, not a lot of people were looking at. That's a very different situation today. After I finished my PhD studies, I moved to Australia and then Hawaii and finally to Singapore in 2007. In 2011, I published my PhD thesis as a book, continued to write about how the US-China relations were impacting Southeast Asian security, especially the South China Sea dispute. Now, Russia is not front and center in Asian security by any means, but I've always had a fascination with that country. In fact, the Soviet Union was the very first country I ever visited way back in 1987. And after the Kremlin announced its turn to the East policy in 2012, I began to give more attention to Moscow's role and interests in Southeast Asia, because frankly, it's really an understudied area. Very few people are working on this. And then during the pandemic, I decided that it was time that someone wrote a book about Russia and the region. So I put pen to paper in 2021, and I thought I'd be able to finish the book within a year or so. But then, of course, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that really changed everything. And a large part of this book is devoted to how Southeast Asian countries have responded to the invasion and the subsequent conflict. So the book is out now, and it's the first single-authored book on Russia and Southeast Asia to be published since the end of the Cold War. So I'm excited to see it in print and excited to talk about it.
The Ukraine war looms large in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific more broadly, but Russia itself is an enigma to many countries in the region, I imagine. How clear is Russia's strategy for Southeast Asia? And of course, there's a long history of deep Russian strategic engagement, competition with the U.S. in the Vietnam War, after the Vietnam War with the Russian expansion out of the Sea of Okhotsk from North Pacific. So there are definitely periods where the Soviets were intensely focused on horizontal escalation, basically complicating American security in Asia. But what did you see when you did the book? What's the sort of strategic intent in Moscow? Is it episodically messing with the West, or is there a deeper and longer-term Russian strategic intent in Asia and in Southeast Asia that you can see? How much of this is the same Russia that fought the Japanese in 1904 and expanded in the Sea of Okhotsk and supported Vietnam? And how much of this is sort of Putin's Russia? Sorry for the long question, but basically, what are they after? And how long does it go back in history?
So one of the themes of the book is that the legacy of the Soviet Union in Southeast Asia is still very strong. In fact, I would say that a lot of countries base their current assessment on Russia, not on Putin's Russia over the past 25 years, but actually on the Soviet Union and the role it played in the region during the Cold War. So Russia has a lot of old friends in Southeast Asia. It gave a huge amount of support to national liberation, anti-colonial movements, particularly, of course, in Vietnam and Laos. In Indonesia, Sukarno's Indonesia. It has even longer ties going back with Thailand, back to Tsarist Russia, where the two royal families forged close relationships. So the Soviet Union played a huge role in the region during the Cold War. And then in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it basically disappeared. Russia's foreign policy priorities in the 90s were establishing relations with the newly independent republics that had formerly been part of the Soviet Union, and to normalize relations with its former enemies in the West, specifically the US, NATO, and the European Union. So Asia was accorded a much lower priority than the post-Soviet space and the Euro-Atlantic. And when Moscow did look to Asia, it really focused on Northeast Asia, on the economic powerhouses of China, Japan, and South Korea, because it wanted to sell arms and oil and gas to these countries. And it also wanted them to invest in Siberia and the Russian Far East. There was almost no bandwidth left for Southeast Asia during this period, with perhaps the exception of Vietnam, which was an old ally. But again, that relationship during the 90s was trying to resolve some of the problems outstanding from the Soviet Union, including Vietnam's large debt and how it was going to pay for arms in the future and that kind of thing. And then it was not until Putin came to power in 2000 that Moscow, I think, really began to take a much more serious look at Asia, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008, when the Kremlin realized it needed to reduce its economic dependence on Europe by strengthening economic ties with countries in the Asia-Pacific. The focus was still very much, again, on Northeast Asia, particularly China, whose economy was growing very fast. But Southeast Asia started to receive a bit more attention too. So what are the aims of Russia in the region? Well, I guess like most countries, it's mainly economic. Russia wants to trade with what it sees as the dynamic economies of the Asia-Pacific. Russia doesn't have a lot to offer, really, except for natural resources, certain kinds of technologies such as arms. It's also trying to sell its nuclear expertise in the region. And Russia sees itself as a great power, and it wants a seat at the table on all the major multilateral organizations. It's not a proactive player in many of these organizations, but it feels that it should be there. It has a right to be there because of its great power aspirations. It has a very close relationship with China, as we know. That's almost, I think, the cornerstone of Putin's foreign policy. I think he regards that as a great success, even though Russia has become more dependent on China. We can talk about that a bit later. And Russia and China have somewhat the same aims in the region, which is to counter US primacy, which they see as a threat to their own foreign policy interests, to their own domestic politics. And they have a common goal in trying to undermine that primacy and trying to split apart America's relationships in the region.
Are they succeeding in any way, shape, or form in prying apart America's relationships in the region?
No, they tried with both the Philippines and Thailand, and they didn't get very far. Of course, you remember under President Duterte, who's now in detention in The Hague, Duterte wanted to rebalance the Philippines' foreign policy. He wanted to reduce the Philippines' dependence on the US. And to that end, tried to strengthen relations with both China and Russia. And Russia was very keen to take advantage of this. They wanted to sell arms to the Philippines, but the Philippine national security establishment pushed back. And in fact, Russia was never able to sell anything to the Philippines. They tried the same thing with Thailand after the coup in 2014, when the US again put Thailand in the freezer box. Again, they tried to use arms to drive a wedge between the US and Thailand. But again, that didn't work, mainly because the Chinese offered them much cheaper equipment. And so they went for the Chinese equipment instead. So not terribly successful. In fact, apart from China, not a huge amount of success for Russia in the Indo-Pacific over the past few years, and certainly since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
There was the news report recently that the Russians were preparing or proposing the establishment of either an airbase or access for its bombers in Indonesia. That played in the Australian election, and the government kind of said there's no there, and the opposition briefly tried to point to it as evidence that the government was asleep at the wheel on security, and it kind of disappeared into the ether as a story. I'm sure you tracked it. What did you make of that? That, by the way, would have been pretty significant and complicated Australian, American, and Japanese, and presumably Southeast Asian security planning. But what was that and what happened to it?
I mean, it was not a surprise in some sense in that the Russians have been interested in establishing a presence on that island, Biak Island in Papua, for some time. So it didn't come out of the blue. They actually wanted to establish some kind of satellite launch facility there in the early 2000s, and that didn't work. And then they offered it to Elon Musk, but that didn't work either, or not so far anyway. And then a few years ago, they sent a couple of long-range bombers to these islands for reasons at the time which were not clear. But it seems to have been a negotiating ploy in that at that time, Indonesia and Russia were negotiating the purchase of a dozen jet fighters. And the Russians may have asked for access to this airfield in Papua as part of an offset agreement for these fighter jets. That order was apparently cancelled in 2020, but now under President Prabowo, it seems to be back on the table. So it could be again that the Russians are asking for access to this airbase as potentially part of a deal to sell fighter jets to Indonesia. It would give Russia pretty close access to Darwin and Perth to monitor US and Australian military activity, so that shouldn't surprise us. On the other hand, however, from an Indonesian point of view, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. It would certainly rile the Australians, the Americans, and everybody else. And it's not really in congruence with Indonesia's claims to have a non-aligned policy. It's not in their constitution that they can't have foreign military forces in the country, but they've never allowed foreign forces to be stationed in the country. And then it went away. And Indonesia denied it, but Russia they didn't deny it, that they'd asked or that this had been discussed. And then it just disappeared. But perhaps it'll be back soon.
It's at a minimum an irritant for Australia and the US and others, a reminder Russia's present. Prime Minister Albanese's trip to Indonesia was pretty effusive in the praise for Australia-Indonesia friendship. Best friend ever. So, maybe the Indonesians got a little bit out of it in terms of attention. One area where the Russians might find they have more influence is in military sales. You could look at it either way. Their kit was blown apart by a much less heavily armed Ukrainian military, not the best marketing campaign. On the other hand, Putin's turning the entire Russian economy into a military-industrial factory and will want to export that. And they do have battle-tested drones and other things. What do you see as the future of Russia's influence with countries like Vietnam or Indonesia and others going forward because of the war footing their economy is on and some of the testing of equipment in Ukraine? Or do you think pretty much it's not going to be easy for them to market their kit in Southeast Asia?
So for almost the first 2 decades of this century, Russia was actually the largest provider of arms to Southeast Asia. But 80% of that equipment went to one customer, and that was Vietnam. And then after the Russians annexed Crimea in 2014, the Vietnamese started to get cold feet with the Russians. After the West imposed financial sanctions and export controls on Russia, which did have an impact on Russia's defense industry, the Vietnamese and other countries began to question Russia's reliability as an arms provider. Now, those questions have only intensified since Russia invaded Ukraine. The financial sanctions and export controls have been tightened. So even if countries wanted to buy Russian arms, it's very difficult to pay for them now because all of those financial transactions used to go through banks in New York and London, etc., but now they can't. There's a question of whether Russia can actually supply spare parts and upgrades and munitions. And even if you were to place an order for Russian equipment, can they actually deliver it? Because they need to recapitalize their own armed forces because they've suffered such huge losses in Ukraine. So for all of these reasons, Russia's arms sales around the world, and especially in Southeast Asia, have basically dropped off a cliff. So 10 years ago, the Russians were selling about $1 billion worth of military equipment to Southeast Asia. Last year was about $100 million, which is a huge drop. And most of that went to Myanmar, and Myanmar has very little choice in who it can buy its arms from. In the meantime, of course, Southeast Asian countries have plenty of other choices. They have their traditional suppliers like the US, like France, like Germany, like the UK. And then there are the up-and-coming countries, particularly South Korea. South Korea is on a roll in Southeast Asia when it comes to arms sales. Turkey is catching up, is starting to make inroads as well, particularly with the Muslim-majority countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. So it will be extremely difficult for Russia to regain that lost ground. You can't rule it out, but it's going to be very difficult. I know Indonesia is still interested in buying equipment from Russia, maybe jet fighters, but again, they have other choices, and Russia might not be the best choice for them right now.
So on the affirmative agenda, if you will, Russia's not doing great. We'll get to the ways Russia can be a disruptor in a second, because they still have that ability. But if you look at what I would call the affirmative agenda, the ability of Russia to build relationships and influence, and if you take the classic military acronym DIME across the different instruments of national power, on the D, diplomatic side, no real success driving wedges between the U.S. and its allies. I'll skip over to M, military. Arms sales, very challenging for the reasons you said. Opening bases in places like Indonesia, very challenging. And then E, economics, they don't have a lot to offer. But jumping back to the I, informational or ideational or cognitive, it seems like here the Russians might be a little bit proud of themselves. The response of Japan or Korea, New Zealand, Australia, the IP4 partners of NATO to the Ukraine invasion was very robust. And these U.S. allies, who have strong connections of their own to NATO and Europe anyway, immediately saw and articulated that Russian success in Ukraine would undermine security in Asia, that Russia's alignment with China was undermining security in Asia. But in Southeast Asia, the Russians and Chinese have blunted a lot of that narrative, it seems. They've certainly been under less criticism, with the exception, I think, of Singapore, than they have in North Asia or Australia or New Zealand. It's interesting. I was looking at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, the survey your institute does, which is always very, very interesting. And when Southeast Asians are asked about what worries them, 76% say that ASEAN might become an arena for great power competition. And when they're asked about international events that worry them, Gaza's number one. And Ukraine is tied for number two with China's expansion in Asia, amazingly. So 39% say that the war in Ukraine is a factor. So you have this, I'm hoping you can help us make sense of this, because you have, at least looking at the polling numbers, real alarm about great power rivalry, a sense that what's happening in Ukraine is important. But the narrative in much of Southeast Asia is different from Japan or Korea or Australia. It's all as clear as mud. I suspect that part of this is that post-colonial experience and the historic Soviet support for liberation, communist revolutionary movements. I wonder if part of it is effective disinformation campaigns by China and Russia. Help us make sense of it. What is the zeitgeist in Southeast Asia about the Ukraine war? It's clearly important, and yet people, not as alarmed about Russian behavior as the Japanese, Koreans, Australians are. Seems that Russia and China get a bit of a pass, maybe because it's viewed as a north-south. The Russian propaganda and the Chinese propaganda is that Ukraine is a battle against the white imperial overlords of NATO by the oppressed, colonized people, shockingly like Russia. It's an odd narrative. It seems to work. So anyway, question is as clear as mud because the picture's as clear as mud. Help us make sense of the zeitgeist about Ukraine and Southeast Asia.
So let's talk a little bit about our ICES annual survey of elite opinion. A few years ago, we dropped Russia from some of the questions related to economics because the response from Southeast Asian elites was, look, Russia simply isn't a player when it comes to economics. So we dropped Russia and we replaced it with other countries. When the question is asked about the most important strategic players among ASEAN's dialogue partners, Russia does a little better, especially with Vietnam and Laos. And that's because of that traditional friendship going back to the Cold War, that the Vietnamese and the Laotians, who are still dependent on Russia for their military equipment, still regard Russia as important. The others much less so. The impact of the war. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, the ripple effects of that conflict were it exacerbated rising food and energy prices in Southeast Asia and further disrupted supply chains, which had occurred during the pandemic. So Russia, as I say, is not a big economic player in the region, but it's a huge producer of foodstuffs and fertilizers and cooking oil. And these are very important in Southeast Asia. And when there were shortages of these commodities, prices went up, of course. On the whole, though, when we look at the various responses of Southeast Asian countries to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I go into in some detail in the book, it's the whole spectrum of responses. So at one end of the spectrum, you have Myanmar, which is the only ASEAN member state to actually endorse the invasion. At the other end of the spectrum is Singapore, which was really the only Southeast Asian country to condemn Russia by name and to impose financial sanctions on Russia. And then all the others fall somewhere in between those two poles. So you have Vietnam and Laos, for instance, who abstained from the votes at the UN General Assembly, which condemned Russian aggression. Again, Russia's an old friend. They're not going to condemn Russia. They're not going to criticize Russia. They don't agree with what they did, but they're not going to say anything publicly, at least. Other countries, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, adopted essentially a neutral position. Some of them said, look, this is a faraway conflict. It doesn't really concern us directly. It's a squabble among the big powers, and we certainly don't want to get involved in that. There's no good that will come out of that for us. They voted generally, most of them, in support of the UN General Assembly resolutions on Russian aggression. But that's it. They drew a line after that and said, okay, that's it. Essentially, we're going to move on. Russia, it's interesting. Russia has a relatively benign image in Southeast Asia, despite the invasion of Ukraine. It's not seen as a threat by any country. It doesn't have any territorial maritime disputes with any country. It's seen as an old friend. The Soviet Union was an old friend and gave a lot of support to the region. Russia is generally viewed as an Islamic-friendly country because of its long-standing support for Palestinian statehood. That has a particular resonance in Malaysia and Indonesia. Putin himself has a very good image in the region. He's seen as a strong man, and strong men are popular in Southeast Asia. He's seen as a strong man who's standing up to the West. And this goes down very well in many countries in the region, particularly countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia. And then there's the issue of what is perceived to be the West's double standards and hypocrisy over Ukraine. So when Western countries criticize Russia over the invasion of Ukraine, countries in this part of the world will say, well, look, you guys invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and you invaded Iraq in 2003, and the legal justifications for those invasions were pretty thin. Why do you want us to criticize Russia over Ukraine when you did pretty much the same in the Middle East 20 years ago, and a lot of people died? And these accusations, these criticisms of Western double standards have only intensified since Israel invaded Gaza in October 2023. And certainly leaders from Prabowo in Indonesia, Anwar in Malaysia have said, look, the West is condemning Russia's human rights atrocities in Ukraine, but they're not condemning Israel over human rights atrocities in Gaza. Why these double standards? And it's hard to argue with that, really. In other respects, Russia's narratives have found fertile ground in the region. There's a lot of empathy with the notion that Russia was provoked into attacking Ukraine because of the eastward expansion of NATO, which many countries say, look, it's fair enough that Russia felt threatened by the NATO alliance. It's perfectly legitimate for it to push back. And also, many people buy the narrative that Ukraine is a proxy of the West and that Zelensky is a puppet of America. Very hard to fight these narratives.
I wonder, though, because if you pay attention to Russia's foreign policy under Putin, to Chechnya, to Syria, it's hard to argue that this is an Islamic-friendly leader. And if you pay attention to the origins of the invasion of Ukraine, it has nothing to do with, of course, fascism in Ukraine and only really notionally NATO expansion. It's revanchism. It's exactly the kind of violation of borders and claims of other people's territory based on ethnicity and so forth that was why ASEAN was created. So you would think it's a bit surprising to me. I mean, it's not surprising. For all the reasons you said, it's not surprising. But it does seem to me that if Singapore can be clear-eyed about all of those things I just said, it's a bit of a failure of Western diplomacy that more hasn't been done to reinforce those arguments, even against what you point out rightly as a received wisdom about the West and hypocrisy and imperialism that makes it an uphill battle. But it seems to me there's an information campaign on that the West is losing, and it's not entirely because of the field we're on, which is tough. And it is in part, I think, because of effective disinformation in social media and elsewhere by the Russians and Chinese. And the Singaporeans see right through it. So I don't know, you're in the region, but it does seem to me that this is an area where Western diplomacy isn't going to win necessarily, but surely could have done better than we have. What do you think?
So on the issue, the first issue on whether Russia is an Islamic-friendly state, and you mentioned Chechnya, I don't think any Southeast Asian remembers or even knows about Chechnya.
Right. It's sort of like Xinjiang barely coming up in public discourse, although I'm assured by Malaysian diplomats and Indonesian diplomats that they do raise it quietly with Chinese officials, but it's selective. Let's just put it that way.
As for Syria, I think some countries were somewhat empathized with Russia's story over Syria, that they were intervening to fight terrorism in Syria. So I think that was generally accepted without questioning it, really. You're right. For the real reasons is revanchism or neo-colonialism. But when Southeast Asians think about colonialism, they only think about Western powers. They only think about Europe and to some extent the United States and the Philippines. They don't see Russia as a colonial power, even though, of course, it was a colonial power in Siberia and the Caucasus and Central Asia and arguably in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. They don't equate colonialism with Russia, only with Western countries. That's really interesting. The disinformation campaign, the Russian narrative. So the Russian narratives are being amplified by the Chinese, which gets into, the press in a number of countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, of course, because of its Chinese population. Very hard to fight these narratives because, as I said earlier, this entrenched view that the West is being hypocritical about what's happening in Ukraine. And when the West talks about the importance of the rules-based international order, that seems to be a bit of an esoteric topic for many people in the region. I mean, apart from Singapore, which sees it as an existential issue. So fighting these narratives is very difficult. And you're right. One of the most surprising, not surprising, actually, is that ASEAN as an organization, its response to the invasion was so tepid. Even though Russia had egregiously violated all of the principles that ASEAN holds dear, the importance of sovereignty, territorial integrity, the non-use of force to resolve international disputes, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Russia signed up to these principles in 2004 when it signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Now, all of these principles have been completely violated since 2022, arguably back in 2014. And yet there hasn't been a peep out of ASEAN as an organization. It issued its sort of standard statements of serious concern. And in fact, the war has had almost no impact on ASEAN-Russia dialogue relations. It's gone on just as normal. And under Prime Minister Anwar, he wants to strengthen the dialogue partnership and invited Putin to the East Asia Summit later this year. Whether he turns up or not, we'll see. But another surprising thing, or perhaps again not surprising, is that since the outbreak of the war, 7 leaders of Southeast Asia have met Putin personally. Some of them have even traveled to Russia to meet him. Only Brunei, Singapore, and the Philippines have not met with Putin. So clearly for them, Putin is still someone they can work with, despite the conflict and despite the fact that he's violated all of these principles that they apparently hold so dear.
You said we'll have to see if Putin actually goes to the East Asia Summit. I wonder if he does go, if other leaders skip it.
This was a concern with APEC and with the G20 and with the ASEAN Summit in 2022, 2023. Western countries did put a little pressure on ASEAN countries to say, look, can you disinvite Putin from these forums? The three countries in question, Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia, they stood their ground and they said, look, it's not for us to disinvite a country. Everyone's invited. And so they did invite them. Now, of course, Putin did not travel to any of those countries for several reasons. One, perhaps he may have been concerned about a palace coup if he left the country, or later when he was indicted by the International Criminal Court that he would be arrested. But he's traveling much more now. And he was in Vietnam last year. That's a safe country for him to visit. Whether he will visit Malaysia later this year remains to be seen. And if he does, what will the response of the ASEAN's Western dialogue partners be? Will they boycott the summit? My guess is that they won't. They will probably go and just shun Putin as they did with the G20 in Sydney. You may remember that, I think in 2015. But we'll see. He will be invited and he will make a last-minute decision as he always does.
Always does. Yeah, I think you're probably right. First of all, Donald Trump will have no objection to meeting with Putin. That could change, but it doesn't seem likely to. And it would be an interesting debate within the Japanese Foreign Ministry or DFAT in Australia, because do they want to allow Putin and Xi Jinping to preside over a summit with the ASEAN leaders without the US and Australia and Japan and Korea there? So I think you're probably right.
If I could just add there, Putin doesn't like the East Asia Summit. He's only attended once in person in Singapore in 2018. And that was also because Singapore and Russia were celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations. So I think from Putin's point of view is he sees it as a talk shop. It's not about economics, really. That's why he likes APEC much more than he likes the East Asia Summit. And also the US and China steal the limelight at the East Asia Summit. They're the two big players. Russia's not.
It sort of spotlights that he's a bit player, which he wouldn't like, of course. I was going to ask about North Korea. The Russian relationship with North Korea is obviously deepening with North Korean troops in combat in the war against Ukraine, with Russia enabling North Korea to get around UN sanctions, but potentially doing much worse. We don't know for sure what the quid pro quo was for North Korean troops, but it could very well be help with North Korea's SLBM program, missiles, and so forth. For Japan, for Korea, that aspect of Russia's profile in East Asia is deeply concerning and threatening, and will be a long-term inhibitor to any economic relationship or diplomatic relationship that Putin would want. How does the North Korea factor play in Southeast Asia? I find North Korea as a factor in Southeast Asia pops in and out. I remember when I was in the White House, we were preparing for negotiations with Kim Jong-il, and Megawati told President Bush that she and Kim Jong-il had been playmates because Sukarno and Kim Il-sung had brought them together. And you have to try to imagine, what does Kim Jong-il do for a play date? Pull wings off flies or light anthills on fire? But in any case, Indonesia was quite keen to play a role at that time. Thailand's been a way station for North Korean refugees. There's a lot of episodic, fascinating North Korea dimensions to Southeast Asian diplomacy, but no real sustained ASEAN position that I can see, other than trying to use the ASEAN Regional Forum and other things to play a role. The North Korea-Russia relationship, deeply destabilizing for proliferation and for stability in North Asia. How is it playing in Southeast Asia?
It's not something that I feel has garnered a lot of attention, even though it should have. ASEAN regularly in its communiques talks about the importance of stability on the Korean Peninsula and denuclearization, etc. And as you've just mentioned, Russia's, let's call it what it is, alliance with North Korea has raised tensions on the Korean Peninsula. It's infuriated South Korea and Japan and ruined Russia's economic relations with those two countries. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, both of those countries condemned Russia's actions and imposed sanctions. Then when Russia moved closer to North Korea, it greatly exacerbated tensions with Tokyo and Seoul. Russia, I think essentially as well, has basically given up on the idea of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. I think, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov pretty much admitted to that a few months ago. You're right, we don't quite know what the quid pro quo was for North Korea to supply Russia with millions of munitions and rockets and 10,000 troops in the Kursk area. but it has to have been a combination of money, oil, support for some of North Korea's military programs, particularly satellites and missile launches. And also, Russia has used its position on the UN Security Council to weaken UN sanctions against North Korea. Now, all of this should be of great concern to ASEAN, but I haven't tracked any major, even mild responses from any of the Southeast Asian countries to this. So that's somewhat puzzling.
Let me end by asking what you would advise first to analysts, either in think tanks and universities or perhaps Australia's Office of National Intelligence or Indo-Pacific Command. What would you advise? What is the next shoe that might drop in Russia's strategy in Southeast Asia? Should it be worrisome? How likely is it? So the analytical question, what to watch for next? And then for the diplomats, how should Australian or American or European diplomats be talking about Russia in their engagements with Southeast Asia? Is it the kind of thing that is too hard to move the dial? Or is there an urgency that can be brought to the dialogue regarding Russia's role? So what's the analytical recommendation on what to watch, and what's the diplomatic recommendation on how to engage Southeast Asia on the Russia issue?
Russia is not a major player in Southeast Asia, economically, diplomatically, militarily, but it's still a player. As I've mentioned, it has old friends. It's seen as a useful source of some kinds of technology and certain kinds of commodities. It also has the power to disrupt. That, I think, is Russia's main power. We've seen that front and center since February 2022, that it does not hesitate to assault the rules-based international order. I think China is very different. I think China is much more cautious about this, but Russia is not. I would say to analysts, never underestimate Russia. It's been written off many times. It has suffered, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, half a dozen economic crises, severe ones, and it's always bounced back from those crises. Now, that said, though, the long-term future of Russia, I don't think is very bright. It has very, very severe demographic problems. It has a kleptocracy that seems to be entrenched. There's an unwillingness in Russia to diversify away from oil and gas. So the economy is always going to be dependent on these things. It's always going to have a fairly strong military. It's certainly a very strong nuclear force, and that has to be factored into any equation around the world. So keep watching Russia is what I would say. It is a country that has a lot of strengths. It has some very skilled diplomats. It has a very strong military, even though it suffered in Ukraine. And it has the power to surprise us with what it does around the world, as it did in Crimea and Ukraine, in Syria and other places. As for diplomats, what would I advise diplomats when talking to Russians about Southeast Asia?
Or Southeast Asians about Russia?
Well, I have spoken to quite a few diplomats about this issue. And if they're from Europe particularly, they always want to stress the importance of the rules-based international order and how Russia has assaulted this. And I say, well, I don't think that's really a very good strategy, because the first response will be, well, yes, okay, it's important, but the West is no angel when it comes to this. And they'll bring up the examples of Afghanistan and Iraq and maybe other countries as well. So it's going to be very hard to persuade some of these Southeast Asian countries that Russia is a malign actor in the region. Quite the contrary, many countries see it as it has this benign image going back to Soviet times. So that's going to be a very hard one. And perhaps I think at the end of the day, diplomats really might ought to focus on China rather than Russia, because China is the big power, the big player in the region, not Russia.
When John McCain was running for president in 2008, he was asked about Russia and Putin, and he said that George W. Bush claimed he looked in Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and McCain said, I looked in his eyes, Putin's eyes, and I saw three letters, K, G, and B. Putin will play a weak hand well, not well for the Russian people, but well in terms of getting our attention when it's least convenient. So we should all keep a watchful eye, and your book really helps to do that. Ian, terrific. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.